Welcome back to Tina Romance Library, where powerful alphas fall hard, and the women they underestimate change everything. Every story here is complete, immersive, and emotion-driven. No cliffhangers, no rushed endings, just full romances you can sink into. Today's story? It starts with a condition that seems permanent, the kind that they called the Lycan King sterile, and gave up on his bloodline, until a blunt healer's daughter treated his incurable condition like a badly managed wound, and accidentally rewrote destiny. 9 months later, the kingdom got twins, the nobles got humbled, and the king learned that the real miracle was finally listening to his doctor. So if you love possessive alphas, strong heroines who don't beg, slow burn tension, and emotional payoffs, you're in the right place. I need you to join the pack right now by subscribing. Leave a like if you enjoy immersive romance. And settle in, because once the story begins, we don't stop until the ending. Now, let's get into it. They said the Lycan King was broken. I need you to understand what that means, not just broken like a man who's lost his way, but broken like something fundamental inside him had been ripped out and burned to ash. For 60 years, King Kaelin Thornwrath ruled the Northern Territories with an iron fist and a heart that had long since turned to stone. 60 years of watching his people bring him their daughters, their sisters, their hopes wrapped in silk and desperation, all of them believing they might be the one to give him an heir. 60 years of failure, 60 years of shame that hung in the throne room thicker than the smoke from the hearth fires. The silver had done it, they whispered in the corridors when they thought no one was listening. That cursed blade that had pierced him in the Great War, the one that left a scar across his abdomen that never quite healed right, that burned when the winter winds came howling down from the frozen peaks. Silver poisoning, they called it. It had stolen his future, left him capable of everything a king should be except the one thing that mattered most: continuation, legacy, hope. I was there the day everything changed, though I didn't know it then. None of us did. The throne room was cavernous, all stone and shadow, with windows so high that the weak winter sun barely reached the floor. Tapestries depicting the glory of our ancestors hung on the walls, their threads faded with age, their victories feeling more like accusations than celebrations. Because what good was conquest if there was no one to inherit it? What good was power if it died with you? King Kaelin sat on that throne like it was both his kingdom and his prison, his massive frame somehow making the ornate chair look small. He was built like war itself, broad shoulders that could carry the weight of nations, hands that had crushed enemies and signed treaties, a face that might have been handsome once but had been carved into something harder by time and disappointment. His hair was dark still, shot through with silver at the temples, long enough to brush his collar. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and just as cold. Those eyes had stopped seeing hope decades ago. I watched him watch the newest procession of hopefuls, healers, and nobles and desperate common women, all of them paraded before him like livestock at market. It was grotesque. It was necessary. It was killing him slowly, this ritual humiliation that happened every few months when the council decided to try again. But then she stepped forward. Isla Thornbrook, a healer's daughter from the eastern villages, where the pine forests grew so thick that sunlight became a precious commodity. She wasn't like the others. She didn't lower her eyes or tremble, or present herself like a gift to be unwrapped. She looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw something in her face that I hadn't seen in that throne room in years. Defiance. And underneath it, something that looked almost like recognition. The king dismissed the others with a wave of his hand, barely glancing at them. But when his gaze landed on Isla, something shifted. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and every wolf present felt it, that electric charge that runs down your spine when two dominants lock eyes and neither one blinks first. You, he said, his voice like gravel and smoke, are either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps both, your majesty, she replied, and her voice didn't shake. Not even a little. What happened next happened fast. Too fast for the old laws and the careful protocols. The king stood from his throne, descended those stone steps with a predator's grace, and stopped mere inches from where she stood. I could see her pulse jumping in her throat, could smell the fear mixing with something else, something wild and untamed that made every wolf in the room sit up and take notice. Do you know what you're offering? He asked. Quiet now, dangerous. I know what's been taken from you, she said, and I know what I can give. 9 months later, on a night when the winter winds screamed like dying gods, and the moon hung full and blood-red in the sky, the impossible happened. The Lycan King's son was born, and everything, Everything changed. The child's first cry shattered 60 years of silence. I need you to understand what that sound meant to us, to the kingdom, to the wolves who had served Cassian Thornridge since before some of us were born, to the king himself who stood in the doorway of the birthing chamber, like a man facing his own execution. That cry was proof. It was vindication. It was everything we'd been told could never happen, wailing its lungs out in defiance of fate itself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to before. To the man Cassian was when hope was still a language he'd forgotten how to speak. King Cassian Thornridge wasn't just feared, he was the nightmare that other nightmares told their children about to make them behave. 6'5" of pure dominant alpha, with a presence that could make grown warriors drop their eyes and bare their throats without him saying a single word. He'd united the fractured Lycan territories through a combination of brutal warfare and brilliant strategy, had negotiated treaties that brought peace to lands that had known nothing but blood for generations. His law was absolute. His word was final. His justice was swift and merciless and fair in a way that made even his enemies respect him. But respect doesn't keep you warm at night, and it doesn't fill the empty corridors of a palace that should have been echoing with the laughter of children and grandchildren by now. 60 years. 60 goddamned years of ruling, of building, of sacrificing everything for a kingdom that would die with him. Because that's what they don't tell you about being immortal, you can live forever. But without an heir, your legacy crumbles to dust the moment your heart finally stops beating. The silver poisoning had done more than leave a scar. That blade forged by witch magic and driven through his abdomen by a rival alpha during the War of 7 Packs had burned its poison into his very essence. The wound had healed, eventually, leaving a jagged line of scar tissue that looked like lightning had tried to split him in half. But something deeper hadn't healed. Something in his blood, in his very nature, had been irrevocably altered. Sterile. That's what the healers whispered, though never to his face. Cursed. Broken in the one way that mattered most to a king. He'd tried everything. Subjected himself to examinations that would have humiliated a lesser man. Drank concoctions that tasted like death and made him sick for days. Let healers and witches and shamans poke and prod and mutter over him until he wanted to rip them apart just to make it stop. Nothing worked. Nothing changed. And eventually, even Cassian's legendary stubbornness had to bow to reality. He couldn't have children. He would never have children. The kingdom needed him to be strong, so he was strong. He buried his grief so deep that even he forgot where he'd put it, and he ruled with the cold efficiency of a man who had nothing left to lose. But the nobles couldn't let it go. Lord Aldrich Blackwater led the charge, as he always did, his perfectly groomed beard and calculated smiles hiding the ambition that burned in his eyes like fever. Every council meeting became a battlefield, every gathering of the noble houses an opportunity to remind Cassian of his failure. "Your Majesty," Aldrich would say, his voice dripping with false concern, "the kingdom requires stability, continuity. The people need to know there will be a future after you." What he meant was, "You're old, you're broken. Step aside and let someone more capable take your throne." The whispers were everywhere. In the servants' quarters, where they thought the walls were thick enough to hide their voices. In the training yards, where young warriors speculated about who might challenge for the crown. In the noble estates, where plots were hatched over expensive wine and promises of power. Cassian heard them all. His network of spies was too efficient for anything to escape his notice. He knew exactly which nobles were positioning their sons as potential successors. He knew which ambitious wolves were testing the loyalty of his generals. He knew that Lord Blackwater had been quietly amassing weapons and training his private guard to numbers that exceeded what was strictly legal. He knew, and he let them scheme. Because what was he supposed to do? Execute half the nobility for the crime of stating the obvious? He wasn't a tyrant, despite what his enemies claimed. He was just a king without a future, trying to hold together a kingdom that was already looking past him. There were nights-long, dark nights when the palace slept and he prowled the corridors alone when Cassian would stand in the wing that should have housed his family. Rooms that should have been filled with noise and life and chaos. Nurseries that had never held a cradle. Bedchambers that had never heard a child's nightmare, or a teenager's argument, or the sounds of a life being lived. He'd stand there in the darkness, and he'd think thoughts that would have shocked the nobles who saw him as nothing but cold calculation and controlled violence. Apparently, ruling an empire isn't enough without proof you've reproduced. He'd think with bitter humor that tasted like ash in his mouth. 60 years of keeping these ungrateful bastards alive and prosperous, and what they really want to know is whether my cock still works. The crudeness of the thought would make him smile, just a little. Because if he didn't laugh, he might actually let himself feel the grief. And if he started feeling it, he wasn't sure he'd ever stop. So he buried it deeper, ruled harder, became more untouchable, more remote, more the legend than the man. King Cassian Thornridge, the unbroken, the eternal, the last. That's what they called him, the last king. As if his reign was already over, already just a chapter in the history books that future generations would study and shake their heads over. Poor old Cassian. So much power, and couldn't manage the one thing that mattered. He let them think what they wanted. Let them whisper and plot and scheme, because the truth was worse than anything they suspected. The truth was that Cassian had stopped hoping decades ago, had accepted his fate with the same grim determination that had gotten him through every battle, every loss, every impossible situation he'd ever faced. He would rule until he died, and then the kingdom would tear itself apart fighting over his crown, and there wasn't a damned thing he could do about it. That was the truth. That was his reality. Until the day a healer's daughter from the eastern villages looked him in the eye and told him she could give him what everyone said was impossible. Until the day Isla Thornbrook stepped into his throne room and changed everything. The selection ceremony was a spectacle designed to look like hope, but smelled like desperation from every corner of the throne room. They came from every pack territory in the kingdom, daughters of alphas and betas, women from prestigious bloodlines, even a few ambitious commoners who'd somehow secured sponsorship from nobles looking to hedge their bets. All of them dressed in their finest, their hair elaborately styled, their scents carefully masked with perfumes that couldn't quite hide the underlying calculation. The throne room glittered with jewels and silk and barely concealed ambition, and beneath it all ran a current of tension so thick you could choke on it. Because everyone knew what this was really about. This wasn't romance. This wasn't even really about giving the king an heir anymore. Not in any genuine sense. This was about power. About which family, which bloodline, which political faction could claim the privilege of warming the king's bed, and maybe, just maybe, accomplishing what 60 years of failure had proven impossible. I watched them parade through, one after another, each woman announced by title and lineage like they were horses at auction. Lady Evangeline Silvermane, daughter of the Northern Alpha, who moved with predatory grace and smiled like she'd already won. Celeste Darkwater, Lord Aldrich's own niece, whose beauty was as cold and perfect as fresh snow and just as welcoming. Dozens more, all of them polished and practiced and performing. Cassian sat on his throne and endured it with the expression of a man undergoing torture he'd long since grown numb to. He didn't even really look at them anymore. Just nodded at the appropriate moments, asked the questions the council had scripted for him, his voice flat and disinterested. What did it matter? They were all the same pretty packages wrapped around ambition, offering him nothing he actually wanted because what he wanted couldn't be given. And then she walked in. Adrian Thornbrook entered the throne room like someone who'd gotten lost on the way to somewhere else, and was hoping nobody noticed. She wasn't dressed like the others. No elaborate gown dripping with crystals. No hair piled high in complex arrangements that probably required 3 servants and an hour to construct. She wore a simple dress in deep forest green, well-made but practical, her dark hair pulled back in a braid that was already coming slightly loose. Her hands twisted together in front of her, nervous energy radiating off her in waves that every wolf in the room could feel. She was terrified, completely, obviously terrified. And she was looking at everything like she was trying to memorize it. I saw Cassian's eyes actually focus when they landed on her. Saw something flicker across his face that might have been curiosity if he still allowed himself to feel such things. She was pretty in an understated way. Warm brown eyes, a dusting of freckles across her nose, the kind of face that belonged in a healing house tending to sick children, not standing before the Lycan king in a room full of predators. Adrian Thornbrook, the chamberlain announced, his voice carrying a note of confusion because her name came with no impressive titles, no powerful family connections. Daughter of Marcus Thornbrook, master healer of the Eastern Territories. A healer's daughter. Not even from a prominent healing family. Just a country healer from some village where they probably still used folk remedies and superstition. I heard Lady Evangeline actually laugh behind her hand, a soft, cruel sound that made Adrian's shoulders tighten. "Approach," Cassian said, his voice neutral, but something in his posture had changed. He was actually paying attention now, leaning forward slightly, his storm-gray eyes tracking her movement as she walked toward the throne on legs that looked like they might give out at any moment. She stopped at the designated spot, where dozens of women before her had stood and postured and preened. She didn't do any of those things. She just stood there, her hands still twisted together, and when she looked up at him, there was something in her eyes that none of the others had shown. Fear, yes, but underneath it, anger, frustration, and a burning, desperate need to understand something. "Why are you here?" Cassian asked, and it wasn't the scripted question the council had prepared. This was genuine curiosity, maybe the first real emotion I'd heard from him in years. Adrian opened her mouth, closed it, then seemed to gather herself. "My father," she said, her voice quieter than the others but steady, "spent 40 years studying the old texts, the really old ones, from before the Great Schism. He became obsessed with silver poisoning, with how it affects our kind differently than it affects humans or even regular wolves." Cassian went very still, dangerous still, the kind of stillness that usually preceded violence. "Your father studied me like I was a research subject." "No," she said, and there was that anger again, flashing in her eyes. "He studied the silver, because his brother, my uncle, died from it after the border skirmishes 15 years ago. Slowly, painfully. And nobody could help him because nobody understood what silver actually does to us at a cellular level. My father dedicated his life to finding answers, and he..." Her voice cracked. "He died 3 months ago, still searching." The throne room had gone silent. Even Lady Evangeline had stopped smirking. "I'm sorry for your loss," Cassian said carefully, "but that doesn't explain why you're standing in my throne room dressed like a candidate for my bed." Color flooded Adrian's cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Because my father's research suggested something impossible. That silver poisoning doesn't make us sterile, it makes us incompatible. That the right bloodline, the right genetic combination, could overcome it. He spent years trying to identify the markers, the specific traits that might..." She stopped, seemed to realize she was rambling. "I didn't come here seeking power or status, Your Majesty. I came here because my father died believing he'd found an answer, and I need to know if he was right. So I'm an experiment to you," Cassian said, his voice dropping to something cold and deadly. "A way to prove your father's theories. You're the only way to prove them," she shot back, and there was no fear in her voice now, just raw honesty. "Every healer in the kingdom has tried to help you. Every remedy, every treatment, every prayer to the old gods. Nothing worked because nobody understood what they were actually treating. But my father did. He understood. And if he was right, if his research was correct, then you're not broken, Your Majesty. You're just waiting for the right match." The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a promise, like the most dangerous kind of hope. I watched Cassian's face, saw the war happening behind his eyes. 60 years of disappointment had taught him not to hope. Had taught him that hope was just another word for delayed heartbreak. But here was this slip of a girl, this healer's daughter with nervous hands and honest eyes, offering him the one thing he'd convinced himself he could never have. "What's your bloodline?" he asked finally. "Common," she admitted. "No alpha blood, no prestigious ancestry. But my great-grandmother was a white wolf, a healer born during the blood moon. It's rare, the genetic markers. But my father believed that a healer's bloodline might counteract silver poisoning," Cassian finished, and something that might have been respect flickered in his eyes. "Your father was either brilliant or insane." "He was both," Adrian said, and she almost smiled. "Most brilliant people are." Cassian stood then, descended the throne steps with that fluid, predatory grace that made every instinct scream danger. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, close enough that I could see her pulse jumping in her throat again. "And if your father was wrong?" he asked quietly. "If we try this and it fails like everything else has failed, you'll have given yourself to me for nothing. Then at least I'll know," she whispered. "At least I'll have tried. That's more than doing nothing." Something shifted in the throne room then. The other candidates, the nobles, the council members, they all faded into irrelevance. Because in that moment, it wasn't about politics or power or continuing bloodlines. It was about two people who'd both lost something fundamental looking at each other, and seeing a possibility, however slim, of finding it again. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met," Cassian said, "or the most foolish." My father used to say those were the same thing," Adrian replied. And for the first time in 60 years, the Lycan King laughed. The council exploded the moment Cassian dismissed the other candidates and requested a private audience with the healer's daughter. I heard Lord Aldrich's outraged voice echoing down the corridor as I escorted Adrian to the king's private study. Something about propriety and proper selection protocols and the insult to the noble families who'd presented their finest. Let him ray. Cassian had made his choice, and when the Lycan king made a decision, arguing with it was about as productive as arguing with a mountain. Adrian walked beside me in silence, her earlier bravado seeming to have drained away now that the reality of the situation was sinking in. She'd just volunteered herself to the most powerful and dangerous man in the kingdom, based on her dead father's theories and her own desperate need for answers. The weight of that was written all over her face. "He won't hurt you," I told her quietly as we reached the study door. "Whatever else he is, Cassian Thornridge doesn't harm women." She looked at me with those observant brown eyes. "I'm not afraid he'll hurt me," she said. "I'm afraid I'll disappoint him." Before I could respond to that, the door opened, and Cassian stood there, having already changed out of his formal robes into simple dark clothing that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. Without all the trappings of kingship, you could see him for what he really was, a warrior who'd never quite figured out how to stop fighting. "Come in," he said to Adrian, then looked at me. "Privacy, Marcus." I nodded and took up position outside the door, close enough to respond if needed, but far enough to grant them the illusion of being alone. Through the heavy wood, I could hear their voices, his low rumble, her softer tones but not the words. Not at first. Inside that study, everything was about to change. I just didn't know it yet. What I learned later, what Adrian told me months afterward when we'd become something like friends, was that Cassian had gestured her to a chair by the fire, and then prowled the room like a caged animal, unable to sit still, unable to relax even in his own private space. "Talk to me like you would any patient," he'd said finally, stopping by the window that overlooked the snow-covered training yards. "Not like I'm the king. Just talk to me like I'm someone who needs healing." And that's exactly what she did. Adrian started asking him questions, medical questions, detailed and specific, about the injury, about the symptoms, about what treatments had been tried and what the results had been. She asked about pain levels and sleep patterns, and whether certain foods or activities made things worse. She asked about the silver itself, what type of blade, what kind of forging, whether there had been any magical enchantments woven into the metal. Cassian answered her. And somewhere in the process of being treated like a patient instead of a king, something in him began to unbend. He found himself telling her things he'd never told the official healers about the nightmares where he could still feel the blade twisting in his gut, about the bone-deep cold that settled into the scar tissue every winter, about the way certain smells would make his stomach clench with remembered agony. She listened, really listened. Not with pity or disgust, but with the focused intensity of a healer trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, she asked to see the scar. Cassian hesitated. He'd been examined by dozens of healers over the years, had long since lost any modesty about his body, but something about showing this nervous healer's daughter his greatest vulnerability made him pause. Still, he'd agreed to this. He'd chosen her. So he pulled his shirt over his head and turned to face her in the firelight. Adrian's sharp intake of breath told him she saw it. The jagged scar that ran from just below his ribs across his abdomen, angry and raised even after all these years. Silver scars didn't heal like normal wounds. They stayed raw, stayed visible, a permanent reminder of the poison that had seeped into his system. She approached slowly, her healer's instincts warring with her awareness of him as a man, as an alpha, as something dangerous standing half-naked in firelight. "May I?" she asked, her hand hovering near the scar but not touching. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Her fingers were cool when they made contact with his skin, gentle as she traced the line of scar tissue. Cassian felt his muscles tense, involuntarily, not from pain, but from the simple shock of being touched with tenderness instead of clinical detachment. She was murmuring to herself, words he couldn't quite catch, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then her fingers found something, pressed slightly, and Cassian hissed through his teeth. "There," she said, her voice sharp with discovery. "Do you feel that? The way the tissue is harder here and here?" Her fingers moved along the scar, finding spots that made him flinch. "That's not scar tissue, that's calcification. The silver particles are still in your body, Your Majesty. They've been sitting here for 60 years, slowly leaching poison into your system." Cassian stared at her. "That's impossible. The healers removed the blade immediately. They spent weeks treating the wound. They removed the blade," Adrian agreed, still examining the scar with those careful, probing fingers. But silver doesn't work like normal metal. When it enters a werewolf's body, especially through a weapon designed to kill our kind, it fragments. Tiny particles break off and embed themselves in the surrounding tissue. The healers probably got the main pieces, but these, she pressed again, and he felt that deep, wrong ache that he'd lived with for so long he'd stopped noticing it. These are small enough that they wouldn't have seen them with conventional examination methods. She stepped back, looked up at him, and something like anger flashed in her eyes. "With respect, Your Majesty, whoever treated you did a terrible job." The words hung in the air for a moment. Then Cassian laughed a real laugh, not the bitter mockery from earlier, but genuine amusement at her absolute audacity. Here he was, half-naked and scarred, the most powerful man in the kingdom, and this slip of a girl had just insulted the entire royal medical staff to his face. "Those healers were the best in the kingdom," he said, still smiling. "Then your kingdom needs better healers," she shot back, then seemed to realize what she'd said. The color drained from her face. I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Don't apologize for honesty," Cassian said, pulling his shirt back on. "It's refreshing. Everyone else is so busy being careful with me that they forget to be useful." He sat down finally, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. "So you're saying I've been carrying silver poison in my body for 60 years, and this is why you can't conceive," Adrian finished quietly. "Yes, silver disrupts our entire system, but it particularly affects reproductive function. It's like," she struggled for the right metaphor, "like trying to plant seeds in contaminated soil. It doesn't matter how healthy the seeds are if the environment is toxic. And you think you can fix this?" It wasn't a question. "I think my father found a way," she said carefully. "The White Wolf bloodline carries certain healing properties. It's not magic exactly, more like a genetic compatibility that allows us to counteract silver on a cellular level. If I'm right, if his research was correct, then prolonged exposure to my blood might help your body finally purge the remaining silver particles." Cassian looked at her for a long moment. "Prolonged exposure? You mean—" "I mean exactly what this selection ceremony implies," she said, meeting his eyes with that devastating honesty. "We would need to bond. Deeply. The kind of bond that allows blood exchange, scent marking, the full connection between mates. It's the only way the healing properties would transfer effectively." "You're asking me to mate with you as a medical treatment," Cassian said slowly. "That's insane," she offered. "Desperate? Completely inappropriate?" "I was going to say pragmatic," he replied. "But those work too." They looked at each other across the study, two people who'd somehow stumbled into a possibility that terrified them both. Because this wasn't about politics or duty or continuing bloodlines anymore. This was about hope, fragile, dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, the impossible wasn't quite as impossible as everyone thought. "If we do this," Cassian said finally, "and your father was wrong, if we bond and nothing changes, then we'll deal with it," Adrian interrupted. "Together. That's what bonded pairs do, isn't it?" And in that moment, standing in his private study with firelight dancing across her determined face, Cassian Thornridge felt something he hadn't felt in 60 years. He felt like maybe, just maybe, the future wasn't already written. The announcement came at dawn, when the winter sun was just beginning to paint the snow-covered palace grounds in shades of rose and gold. King Cassian Thornridge had made his choice. Not Lady Evangeline with her alpha bloodline and political connections. Not Celeste Darkwater, who would have tied him to Lord Aldrich's powerful faction. Not any of the carefully vetted, politically advantageous candidates that the council had spent months selecting. He chose the healer's daughter from the eastern villages. The girl with no title, no power, no influential family to back her claim. He chose Adrienne. The palace erupted into chaos before the sun had fully risen. I watched it unfold from my position outside the king's chambers. Nobles storming through the corridors demanding audiences. Council members clustering in urgent whispered conferences. Servants scurrying between rooms carrying messages that grew more frantic by the hour. Lord Aldrich's face had gone an interesting shade of purple when he'd heard, and Lady Evangeline had reportedly thrown a priceless vase against the wall of her guest chambers hard enough to shatter it into dust. Let them rage. Cassian had given them what they'd been demanding for decades, a chance at an heir. The fact that he'd done it his way instead of theirs was just going to have to be something they learned to live with. Inside the king's private chambers, away from the political firestorm, Cassian and Adrian were having a conversation that would define everything that came after. I wasn't there for it, privacy, as Cassian had ordered, but Adrian told me about it later. her voice soft with something that might have been wonder or might have been terror. Probably both. They'd sat across from each other at the small table where Cassian took his private meals, the formal distance between them a sharp contrast to the intimacy of what they were discussing. The morning light streaming through the windows made Adrian's dark hair gleam with hints of auburn. Caught the nervous way her hands kept finding each other in her lap, Cassian watched her with an intensity that would have been intimidating if there hadn't been something almost vulnerable underneath it. "I need you to understand what you're agreeing to," he'd said, his voice rough from a sleepless night. "This isn't a fairy tale. I'm not some cursed prince who just needs true love's kiss to break the spell. I'm a man who's been broken for 60 years, and your father's theories might be brilliant or they might be the desperate hopes of a grief-stricken researcher. We don't know." "I know," Adrian had replied quietly. "The nobles will make your life hell," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "They'll see you as an upstart, a nobody who stole what should have gone to one of their daughters. They'll smile to your face and plot behind your back. The ones who don't openly despise you will try to use you as a pawn in their political games. I understand. And if this doesn't work," his voice dropped lower, almost breaking, "if we go through with the bonding and nothing changes, you'll be tied to me for the rest of your life, mated to a king who can't give you children, who can't give the kingdom the heir they're all desperate for. You'll have sacrificed everything for nothing." "It won't be for nothing," she said, and there was steel in her soft voice. "Even if the healing doesn't work the way my father hoped, I'll learn something. I'll understand the silver poisoning better. Maybe I can help others who've been affected. Maybe you're trying to save everyone except yourself," Cassian interrupted, and something in his eyes was unbearably gentle. "You don't have to do this, Adrian. I chose you because I believe in your father's research, because you offered me something I'd stopped believing was possible. But you can still walk away. I'll protect you from the political fallout. I'll make sure—" "Stop," she said, standing abruptly enough that her chair scraped against the floor. "Stop trying to give me an escape route. I came here of my own free will. I volunteered for this knowing exactly what it might mean. And yes, part of it is about proving my father right, about honoring his research and his memory. But part of it," she paused, seeming to gather courage, "part of it is that last night, when I touched your scar and felt how much pain you've been carrying alone for all these years, something in me broke. You've spent 60 years being strong for everyone else. Maybe it's time someone tried to be strong for you." The silence that followed her words was profound. Cassian stared at her like she'd just spoken, in a language he'd forgotten existed. "You feel sorry for me," he said finally, and there was something dangerous in his voice. "That's not a foundation for—" "I don't feel sorry for you," Adrian cut him off, her voice sharp. "I feel angry for you. Angry that you've been suffering for decades because the healers who treated you didn't understand what they were dealing with. Angry that instead of getting real help, you've been subjected to political marriage parades like your livestock being bred. Angry that everyone in this kingdom seems to think your worth is defined by whether or not you can produce an heir." She stepped closer, her eyes blazing with an emotion that was definitely not pity. "You're not broken, Your Majesty. You're injured. There's a difference, and I'm a healer. Fixing injuries is what I do." Cassian stood slowly, his considerable height making him tower over her, but she didn't back down, didn't drop her eyes. Just stood there radiating righteous fury on his behalf, this small woman who'd known him less than a day and was already defending him against the world. "No promises," he said quietly. "I won't promise you that this will work, that we'll have the fairy tale ending everyone wants. I won't lie to you about what this life will be like." "Good," she replied. "I don't want promises. I want honesty. And if I'm honest with you right now," he continued, reaching out slowly to cup her face in one large hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone, "I have to tell you that I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be anything other than a king. I don't know how to let someone close enough to help me. I'll probably be difficult and stubborn and impossible." "You're a patient," Adrian said, leaning slightly into his touch in a way that seemed unconscious, instinctive. "I've dealt with difficult patients before, though I admit, none of them could have me executed for impertinence." That surprised a laugh out of him, sharp and genuine. "I'm not going to execute you for having opinions, Adrian." "Good to know," she said, and she was almost smiling, "because I have a lot of them. Starting with the fact that your diet is terrible for someone with silver poisoning, your sleep schedule is actively making things worse, and whoever arranged your bedroom has it positioned to get drafts that are probably aggravating your scar tissue every night." He stared at her. "We've been having this profound moment about bonding in the future, And you're thinking about my bedroom arrangement? I'm a healer, she said simply. I'm always thinking about how to make things better. It's who I am. And that's when it happened. That's when Cassian Thornridge, the unbroken king who'd spent 60 years being invulnerable and untouchable, felt something shift in his chest. Because this woman, this nervous, honest, impossibly brave woman, wasn't looking at him like he was a king or a legend or a political opportunity. She was looking at him like he was a person who needed help, a person worth helping. For the first time in decades, Cassian felt seen, not as the king, not as the powerful alpha, not as the tragic figure who couldn't produce an heir, just as a man who was hurting and had been hurting for a very long time, and here was someone who actually wanted to make that better. We do this my way, he said softly. No political maneuvering, no council oversight of our private lives. What happens between us stays between us. Agreed. And if at any point you want out, if this becomes too much, if I become too much, you tell me. No matter what the bond does, no matter how far along we are in the process, your well-being matters more than any heir. Adrian's eyes softened. I'll tell you. But the same goes for you. If this isn't working, if I'm making things worse somehow, you have to tell me. This has to be a partnership, not just me treating you like a patient. A partnership, Cassian repeated, like he was testing out a foreign word. Then he nodded. All right, a partnership. No promises about the outcome, but we face it together. Together, she agreed. They stood there in the morning light, two people who'd just committed to something that terrified them both, and the weight of it settled between them like a living thing. The bonding ceremony would be in 3 days, enough time for the necessary preparations, but not so long that the political opposition could organize anything effective. 3 days until Adrian Thornbrook became something more than a healer's daughter, until Cassian allowed someone past his defenses for the first time in living memory. 3 days until everything changed. Outside the chamber doors, I heard the sound of raised voices, more nobles demanding an audience, more political chaos that Cassian would have to navigate. But for this moment, in this room, he let himself just be still. Let himself lean into the impossible possibility that maybe, just maybe, he'd found someone who could see past the crown to the man underneath. Someone who looked at his scars and saw not failure, but a problem to be solved. Someone who made him feel, for the first time in 60 years, like the future might actually be worth living for. The treatments began the morning after the bonding ceremony, in the private healing chamber that Adrian had insisted be set up in the king's personal wing. I need you to understand what she was attempting. This wasn't some gentle herbal remedy or soothing poultice. This was aggressive intervention targeting silver particles that had been calcifying in Cassian's tissue for 6 decades. Particles that had essentially become part of him, woven into his body at a molecular level. Removing them wasn't surgery, it was closer to exorcism. The first session nearly killed him. Adrian had prepared a compound based on her father's research, white wolfsbane distilled with her own blood, mixed with elements I couldn't even pronounce, all of it designed to bind to silver particles and draw them out through the skin. In theory, it should have worked like drawing poison from a snake bite. In practice, it felt like being stabbed with that original blade all over again. I was stationed outside the chamber, but I could hear Cassian's roars of pain echoing through the thick walls, deep, guttural sounds that made every wolf in the palace freeze with instinctive fear because that was the sound of an alpha in agony. The kind of pain that bypassed dignity and self-control and went straight to the animal brain. It lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of Adrian working over him while he writhed on the treatment table, his body fighting against the compound even as it fought against the silver. Everything in him screaming that this was wrong, this was worse than the original injury. This needed to stop. But she didn't stop. And more importantly, he didn't make her. When the doors finally opened, Adrian stumbled out looking like she'd aged 10 years in 3 hours. Her hands were shaking, her dress was soaked with sweat, and something that looked disturbingly like blood, and her eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of bearing witness to suffering she couldn't prevent, even as she caused it. He needs to rest, she said, her voice hoarse. Don't let anyone disturb him. Not the council. Not. I'll handle it, I assured her. How is he? Alive, she said, and it sounded like a prayer of thanks. The compound is working. I could see the silver particles beginning to surface. But the pain... She broke off, pressed her hands to her face. Marcus, the pain is worse than I expected. Worse than anything in my father's notes. And we have to do this every day for at least 2 weeks before we'll know if it's actually healing the underlying damage. Every day. 2 weeks of torture that would break most men by the 3rd session. But Cassian wasn't most men. The 2nd session was somehow worse than the first because now he knew what was coming. I watched him walk to that healing chamber with the grim determination of a man approaching his own execution, every line of his body tight with anticipated agony. He'd barely recovered from the first treatment. I could see the exhaustion in the way he moved, the pallor under his normally tanned skin. Adrian met him at the door, her own exhaustion evident but her resolve unshaken. "We can wait another day," she offered quietly. "Give your body more time to—" "No," Cassian cut her off. "If we're doing this, we do it right. Every day, like you said. I've endured worse." That was a lie and they both knew it, but she nodded and led him inside. This time, I heard him curse. Viciously, creatively, in languages I didn't even recognize. Heard the sound of something shattering. He'd grabbed a glass beaker off the table and thrown it against the wall in a moment where the pain overwhelmed his control. Heard Adrian's voice, steady and calm, talking him through it like she was guiding him through a battlefield. "Breathe, Cassian. I know it hurts. I know, but breathe. The compound is working. I can see more particles surfacing. We're making progress. Just breathe through it." By the 5th session, I learned that Cassian had started talking during the treatments. Rambling, really. Anything to distract himself from what Adrian was doing to him. He told her about the War of 7 Packs, about the specific battle where he'd been injured. Described it in brutal detail, the smell of blood and smoke, the way the rival Alpha had come at him with that silver blade while he was already wounded, the moment the weapon had punched through his defenses and into his gut. "Should have dodged left," he gasped out as Adrian applied the compound to a particularly dense cluster of silver particles. "Saw it coming. Was too slow. Too damn slow." "You were fighting 3 opponents at once," Adrian said, her hands steady even as his body jerked beneath them. "I read the battle reports. You were protecting your second-in-command who'd gone down with a leg wound. You were exactly where you needed to be. Got stabbed for my trouble," he panted. "Some protection. You survived. Your second survived. And you won the battle. I'd say that counts as successful protection." He laughed then, a broken sound that turned into a groan as another wave of pain hit. "You have a very generous definition of success." By the 8th session, something had shifted between them. The intimacy of shared suffering had broken down walls that political alliance never could have touched. Adrian had seen him at his most vulnerable, had literally held him down when the pain made him try to escape the treatment table, had wiped the sweat from his face and the tears he wouldn't acknowledge from his eyes, had absorbed his curses and his rage and his moments of despair with unshakable calm. And Cassian had learned to trust her in a way that went bone deep. Learned that when she said the treatment was working, she meant it. That when she promised the pain would end, it actually did. That she would push him exactly as hard as he could handle and not an inch further. "If I survive this," he groaned during session 9, "I'm banning healers. All of them. From the entire kingdom." "You'll thank me later," Adrian replied, not even looking up from where she was carefully extracting a particularly stubborn silver fragment that had worked its way to the surface of his skin. "I'll thank you now if you give me something to knock me unconscious." "Can't do that. Your metabolism would burn through any sedative strong enough to put you under, and the compound needs your system active to work properly. You know this. We've been over it." "Doesn't mean I have to like it," he muttered, then sucked in a sharp breath as she pulled the fragment free. It was tiny, barely visible to the naked eye, but when she held it up to the light, they could both see the dark sheen of silver-laced metal. "That's 63, Adrian said, adding it to the collection she was keeping in a sealed container. 63 fragments we've removed so far." "And how many more?" Cassian asked tiredly. She hesitated. "I don't know. Could be dozens. Could be hundreds. The deeper ones are harder to detect until we clear the outer layers." He closed his eyes. Fantastic. But he came back the next day, and the day after that. By session 12, Cassian had started making dark jokes about the whole process. "You know what nobody tells you about being immortal?" he said as Adrian prepared the compound. "That immortal doesn't mean immune to suffering. Just means you get to suffer longer than everyone else." "Feeling philosophical today?" Adrian asked, and there was fondness in her voice now, the kind that came from spending hours a day with someone in their worst moments and choosing to care about them anyway. "Feeling like I've been turned inside out and scraped with broken glass," he corrected. "But sure, Let's call it philosophical. She started the treatment, and he tensed in preparation for the pain, but something was different this time. The burning was still there, that deep, wrong ache, as the compound worked, but it wasn't as sharp. Not as all-consuming as it had been. "Adrian," he said carefully, "is it supposed to hurt less?" Her hand stilled on his skin. "Does it hurt less?" "Yes, significantly." She leaned closer, examining his scar with the kind of focused intensity that meant she was seeing things beyond what normal eyes could detect. Then she pressed gently on the tissue, in places that had made him flinch in agony just days before. He felt pressure, discomfort, but not that screaming nerve pain that had defined every previous session. "The inflammation is decreasing," she said, and her voice shook slightly. "The tissue is healing, not just the surface, the deep tissue. Cassian, it's working. It's actually working." They stared at each other for a long moment, neither quite daring to believe it. "Don't celebrate yet," he said finally. "We don't know if—" "I know," she interrupted. "We're still weeks away from knowing about fertility. But this?" She pressed her hand flat against his scar, where the tissue was finally starting to soften after 60 years of being rigid and wrong. "This is proof that my father was right. That the white wolf bloodline can counteract silver poisoning. That you're not broken. You were just waiting for the right treatment." Something happened in Cassian's chest, then something that felt like a door opening after being locked for decades. He caught her hand where it rested on his skin, held it there, felt the warmth of her palm against his damaged flesh. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not giving up. For making me endure this hell. For believing it was possible." Adrian's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank me when we're finished. We've still got work to do." "Always the healer," he said, but he was smiling. "Always," she agreed. And they continued the treatments, day after painful day, but now with something neither of them had started with: hope. Real, tangible hope that maybe the impossible was becoming possible after all. That maybe the king who'd been told he was sterile for 60 years might actually have a future worth fighting for. The night Cassian first kissed her, there were no guarantees. 3 weeks into treatments, and the physical improvements were undeniable. The scar tissue was softening. The chronic pain that had plagued him for decades was fading to a dull background ache, and he could move without that constant reminder of the blade that had changed everything. But fertility? That was still an unknown, a question mark that hung between them like a sword waiting to fall. They were in his private sitting room, the one space in the entire palace where he could actually relax, where the weight of the crown didn't press quite so heavily on his shoulders. A fire crackled in the hearth, pushing back the winter cold, and Adrian was curled in one of the large chairs reviewing her father's notes for the 100th time, searching for something they might have missed. She did that a lot now, read those notes like they were sacred texts, like if she just studied them hard enough she'd find the answer to every question. It broke something in Cassian's chest to watch her, this brilliant woman who'd dedicated herself to healing him without any promise of success, who bore the weight of his hope and his kingdom's expectations with a grace that shouldn't have been possible for someone so young. "You should rest," he said quietly from where he stood by the window, watching snow fall over the training grounds. "You've been studying for 6 hours straight." "I'm fine," she replied automatically, not looking up from the notes. "Adrienne." Something in his voice made her look up then, and what she saw in his face made her carefully set the papers aside. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he said, but it was a lie and they both knew it. He crossed to where she sat, lowered himself into the chair across from hers, and for a long moment he just looked at her. Really looked at her, this woman who'd somehow become essential to him in ways that had nothing to do with healing or heirs or any of the practical reasons they'd started this journey. "I'm afraid," he admitted finally, and the words felt like ripping something vital out of his chest. "I'm afraid that I'm falling in love with you, and I don't know if I have the right to." Adrian went very still. "Why wouldn't you have the right?" "Because we started this with a bargain," he said, his voice rough. "Your father's research in exchange for a chance at healing me. A political arrangement that happened to have medical benefits. We agreed to a partnership based on honesty and mutual benefit. Not," he gestured helplessly, "not this. Not what I'm starting to feel every time you walk into a room. Not the way I lie awake at night thinking about you instead of sleeping. Not how the idea of you being hurt or unhappy makes me want to tear the world apart with my bare hands. Cassian, I'm terrified," he continued, the words coming faster now like a dam breaking. "Because what if the treatments work but nothing else does? What if we go through all of this and I still can't give you children? You say you're okay with that now, but what about in 10 years? 20? What happens when you realize you've bound yourself to a man who can offer you everything except the one thing that matters? The one thing that matters to who? Adrian asked, and there was steel in her voice. To the kingdom? To the council? Or to me? He stared at her. She stood, moved to kneel in front of his chair so she could look directly into his eyes, so he couldn't hide from what she was about to say. Listen to me, Cassian Thornridge. I didn't come to this palace to have children. I came to prove my father's research, to heal someone who'd been suffering for decades, to maybe understand something about silver poisoning that could help others. Those were my goals. Those were my reasons. And now? He asked quietly. Now, she said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. Now I'm here because somewhere between the first treatment and the last, somewhere between watching you endure agony without breaking and listening to you make terrible jokes to distract yourself from pain, I fell in love with you too. Not with the king, not with the idea of being queen or the mother of an heir. I fell in love with the man who tells war stories during treatments because silence makes the pain worse. The man who reorganized the palace healer's budget because he noticed they were understaffed after spending time in the healing chamber. The man who pretends to be made of stone but cried when we successfully removed that first silver fragment because it meant hope was possible. I didn't cry, Cassian protested weakly. You did, she said gently. And there's no shame in it. There's no shame in any of this. Not the fear, not the vulnerability, not the uncertainty. This is what love looks like, Cassian. It's messy and terrifying, and there are no guarantees. But here's what I know: I would rather face an uncertain future with you than a guaranteed one with anyone else. His hands came up to cover hers where they rested on his face. Even if we never have children? Even then, she said firmly. I won't lie and say it wouldn't hurt. I won't pretend that part of me doesn't hope for that miracle. But if it doesn't happen, we'll build a different kind of life. We'll find other ways to leave a legacy. We'll fill these empty rooms with something other than children, with students who need training, with orphans who need homes, with healers who need mentorship. We'll make this palace feel alive again in whatever way we can. You make it sound simple, he said. It's not simple at all, she admitted. It's probably the most complicated thing either of us will ever do, but I'm choosing it anyway. I'm choosing you, Cassian. Not the king, not the alpha, not the political alliance or the medical experiment. You. The man who makes terrible dark jokes and reads military history before bed, and refuses to admit when he's in pain because he thinks that makes him weak. I don't think vulnerability is weakness, he corrected quietly. Then prove it, she challenged. Be vulnerable with me. Tell me what you're really afraid of. And so he did. Sitting in that firelit room while snow fell outside and the rest of the palace slept, Cassian told her things he'd never told anyone. About the loneliness of immortality, of watching friends and advisors age and die while he remained unchanged. About the specific shame of being a Lycan king who couldn't produce a Lycan heir, of feeling like he was failing his entire species. About the nightmares where he was still on that battlefield, still feeling the silver blade punch through his defenses, still watching his own blood pool on the ground while he wondered if this was finally the injury that would kill him. About how much it had hurt to bury hope, and how terrifying it was to let himself feel it again. Adrian listened to all of it without flinching, without trying to fix it or minimize it or offer false comfort. She just listened, her hands never leaving his face, her eyes never leaving his, grounding him in this moment, in this room, in this fragile thing growing between them. I'm afraid too, she confessed when he finally fell silent. I'm afraid that I'll fail you, that despite everything we're doing, the treatments won't be enough, that I'll have given you hope only to watch it die again, that I'm not strong enough, or skilled enough, or just enough for what you need. Adrienne, but I'm more afraid of not trying, she continued, of walking away because the risk is too great, of choosing safety over this, she gestured between them, whatever this is becoming. Love, Cassian said simply. It's becoming love. Messy, complicated, absolutely terrifying love. She smiled then, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. Yes, that. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, but she didn't. She met him halfway, and when their lips finally touched, it felt like something fundamental clicking into place. The kiss was gentle at first, almost questioning, but then Adrian's hands slid into his hair, and Cassian's arms came around her waist and pulled her closer, and gentle became something deeper, something that tasted like promise and possibility, and a future that neither of them could predict but both of them wanted desperately to reach. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cassian pressed his forehead to hers and laughed a real laugh, full of genuine joy that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "What?" she asked, smiling against his lips. "I was just thinking," he said, "that if someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be sitting here, kissing a healer's daughter who makes me want to believe in miracles again, I would have had them examined for mental instability. And now?" "Now," he said, pulling back just enough to look at her properly, to see the love shining in her eyes with a clarity that stole his breath. "Now I think maybe I've been the one who was unstable, because this feels like the sanest thing I've done in 60 years. Adrian kissed him again, softer this time, sweeter, and when she pulled back she was still smiling. "For the record, I don't need miracles, Cassian. I just need you. Whatever comes next, whatever happens with the treatments or the kingdom or any of it, I choose you. Not the potential of you, not the healed version of you, just you, exactly as you are right now." And for the first time in 6 decades, Cassian Thornridge allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was enough. Not because he'd finally healed, or because he might someday produce an heir, but because someone had looked at all his scars and broken places and chosen him anyway. That night, they fell asleep in that sitting room, wrapped around each other in a chair that was too small for one person, let alone two, the fire burning low and their hearts beating in sync. And if the rest of the palace wondered where their king had disappeared to, well, that was between Cassian and the woman who'd given him back something more precious than healing. She'd given him back hope, and more than that, she'd given him love without conditions, without guarantees, without any promise of miracles. Just love, raw and real, and absolutely terrifying. And somehow, that was enough. The healer who delivered the news was young, barely trained, which is probably why she stammered through it like she was confessing to a crime instead of announcing the impossible. "Your Majesty, there's no easy way to say this, so the Queen is with child. Children, actually. Twins." The words tumbled out in a rush, and then she stood there trembling, waiting for Cassian to accuse her of lying or losing her mind or any number of things that would have been reasonable responses to claiming the impossible had happened. "I was there when he received the news, standing guard outside his war room where he'd been reviewing Border Patrol reports. I watched the parchment slip from his fingers, watched all the color drain from his face like someone had opened a vein. For a moment, a terrifying, endless moment, he just stood there, completely still, and I couldn't tell if he was about to collapse or explode. Then he moved. He was out of that war room and halfway down the corridor before I could react, moving with a speed and purpose that had servants scrambling to get out of his way. I followed, though I already knew where he was going, where he had to be going. Adrian was in the healing chamber, of course she was, because even 6 weeks into what they'd both started to suspect might be a pregnancy, she'd been too afraid to hope, too terrified of disappointment to seek official confirmation. She'd been treating other patients instead, throwing herself into work like it could distract her from the possibility growing inside her. Cassian burst through those doors like they were made of paper, and the sight that met him stopped him dead in his tracks. Adrian was sitting on the examination table, one hand pressed to her abdomen, tears streaming down her face. But she was smiling this broken, beautiful, disbelieving smile that transformed her entire face. She looked up when he entered, and whatever she saw in his expression made more tears fall. "It's real," she whispered. "Cassian, it's real. 2 heartbeats. I can hear 2 heartbeats." He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms with a desperation that would have been frightening if it hadn't been so obviously rooted in joy. I saw his shoulders shake, saw him bury his face in her hair, and I quietly backed out of the room because this moment, this impossible, precious moment, wasn't meant for witnesses. What Adrian told me later was that they'd stayed like that for nearly an hour, just holding each other, both of them crying, both of them laughing, both of them trying to comprehend that the thing everyone had said was impossible had actually happened. Cassian had eventually pulled back just enough to press his hand to her still flat stomach, his palm spanning the space where their children were growing. "Twins," he'd said, his voice wrecked. "You've given me 2 miracles at once." "We did this together," she'd corrected, covering his hand with hers. "Your body healed. My father's research worked. We both believed it was possible." "I stopped believing decades ago," he'd admitted. "You were the one who had faith enough for both of us." The news spread through the palace like wildfire, and for 3 beautiful days, the kingdom celebrated. There were feasts and ceremonies and impromptu gatherings in the streets where common wolves danced and sang about the impossible heirs. Even the nobles who'd opposed Adrian's selection seemed caught up in the joy of it. The Lycan king would have heirs after all. The line would continue. The kingdom was secured. For 3 days, everything was perfect. Then someone tried to kill her. It happened in the palace gardens, where Adrian had gone to gather herbs for one of her remedies. She'd taken 2 guards with her standard protocol now that she carried the heirs, but whoever planned the attack had planned it well. The guards went down first, crossbow bolts to the throat before they could even shout a warning. Then the assassins moved in. 4 of them, masked, dressed in black, moving with the kind of precision that spoke of professional training. They'd researched their target too, brought silver-coated blades because they knew Adrian's white wolf bloodline made her more vulnerable to silver than most Lycans. They'd planned for everything. Everything except Adrian's survival instincts. The first assassin lunged and she shifted partially, just her hands to claws, just enough to rake across his face and send him stumbling back. The second one caught her arm, the silver blade burning through her sleeve and into her skin, and the smell of her blood hit the air just as Cassian emerged from the palace. I don't know how he knew. Some bond between them, some instinct that said his mate was in danger. But he came out of those doors already shifting, already moving. And what happened next? I've been in combat. I've seen Cassian fight in wars, seen him tear through enemy lines like they were made of paper. But I'd never seen him like this. This wasn't strategy or controlled violence. This was primal alpha rage channeled through 60 years of fighting experience, and it was absolutely terrifying. The assassin holding Adrian died first. Cassian's jaws closed around his throat and ripped it out before the man even registered the attack. The second assassin managed to draw his blade before Cassian's claws opened him from shoulder to hip. The third one tried to run and made it approximately 10 feet before Cassian brought him down, and the sounds that followed were the kind that would haunt everyone who heard them. The fourth assassin was the smart one. He dropped his weapon and surrendered immediately, hands in the air, probably hoping for mercy. He didn't get it. Who sent you? Cassian's voice was barely recognizable, more growl than speech, as he held the man pinned to the ground with one massive clawed hand. Blood not his own dripped from his muzzle, and his eyes were that eerie gold that meant his wolf was still completely in control. The assassin's silence lasted exactly as long as it took Cassian to apply pressure with those claws. Then he was talking, words tumbling over each other in his desperation to make the pain stop. Names. Noble houses. A conspiracy that went deeper than any of us had suspected. Lord Aldrich Blackwater. 3 other prominent noble families. A plot to eliminate Adrian and her unborn children, destabilize the kingdom, and force Cassian to choose a suitable mate from their own bloodlines. They'd planned for every contingency except the one that mattered most, that Cassian loved her. By the time the palace guard arrived, 3 assassins were dead and the 4th was begging for an execution that would be quicker than what Cassian was planning to do to him. But Cassian had already released him, was already moving to where Adrian sat against the garden wall, cradling her injured arm, her face pale but her jaw set in that stubborn line he'd come to know so well. "The babies," she said immediately as he reached her, before he could ask about her arm, or the pain, or anything else. "Can you hear them? Are they?" Cassian pressed his ear to her abdomen, and the tension that had been coiling through his massive frame eased fractionally. 2 heartbeats, he confirmed, his voice rough. Strong and steady. "They're fine." "Good," she said, then promptly fainted, the adrenaline that had kept her upright finally draining away. The next hours were chaos. Healers working on Adrian's silver-burned arm while Cassian refused to leave her side, even covered in blood that wasn't his, even still half-shifted because his wolf wouldn't retreat while his mate was injured. Palace guards rounding up members of the conspiracy, because that 4th assassin had sung like a choir when faced with either cooperation or whatever Cassian had promised to do to him. Lord Aldrich tried to flee, made it to the city gates before Cassian's soldiers caught him. When they brought him back in chains to face the king, Aldrich had the audacity to try justifying his actions. The healer's daughter was never fit to be queen, he spat, blood running from where the guards had been less than gentle. Common blood, no political connections, no understanding of what it means to rule. The kingdom deserves exactly what I give it, Cassian interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. And right now, what I'm giving it is a demonstration of what happens when someone threatens my family. The executions were public, brutal. Cassian made sure every noble in the kingdom attended, made sure they understood exactly what the price of treason was. This wasn't the calculated king they were used to, this was the warrior who'd united the territories through blood and fire, and he wanted them all to remember why they'd bent the knee to him in the first place. But after the executions, after the political reshuffling and the new oaths of loyalty, Cassian disappeared into his chambers with Adrian for 3 days. Nobody disturbed them. Nobody dared. What happened in those 3 days was between a king and his queen, between a man who'd almost lost everything and the woman who'd given him back his future. They emerged changed Adrian, wearing long sleeves to hide the silver scar on her arm that would never fully fade. Cassian with a new edge to his protectiveness that made even his most loyal guards nervous. The message was clear to everyone in the kingdom. The healer's daughter was queen now, carrying the impossible heirs, and anyone who threatened her would learn exactly how terrifying the unbroken king could be when something he loved was in danger. The miracle had come with a price, but it had also come with proof of something that Cassian had forgotten over 60 years of ruling alone. Love wasn't a weakness. It was the most dangerous kind of strength, and he would burn the entire kingdom to ash before he let anyone hurt his family again. The throne room had never looked like this before. Every noble family in the kingdom had been summoned, not requested, not invited, but summoned with the kind of royal decree that left no room for refusal. They stood in rigid clusters along the walls, their usual political posturing replaced by fear so thick you could taste it on the air, because they'd all seen what happened to Lord Aldrich and his co-conspirators. They'd all witnessed what Cassian became when someone threatened what was his, and now they were waiting to learn if they'd be next. I stood at my usual post near the throne, watching Cassian prowl the raised dais like a caged predator. He'd insisted on full formal regalia for this, the crown that he usually avoided wearing, the ceremonial armor that marked him as both king and warrior, every visible symbol of his authority on display. But underneath all that pageantry, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand kept drifting toward where Adrian stood beside him. She was dressed as queen now, in deep burgundy silk that somehow made her look both regal and dangerous, her dark hair elaborately styled in the way the nobles expected. But the long sleeves covered the silver scar on her arm, and I could see her hand resting protectively over her abdomen where the twins were growing, 6 months along now, and starting to show despite the clever cut of her dress. The doors opened, and the first group was escorted in 3 noble families who'd been connected to the conspiracy but hadn't directly participated. Their faces were ashen, their eyes downcast. They knew they were here to learn their fate. Cassian let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then he spoke, his voice carrying to every corner of that massive room. House Greymane, House Riverwood, House Ashford. He named each family with the precision of a judge reading a sentence. Your members provided funding for the assassination attempt on my queen. Your gold paid for silver-coated weapons designed to kill both her and my unborn children. You will explain to me why I shouldn't execute every adult member of your bloodlines and scatter your children to the orphanages. Lord Greymane, to his credit, didn't try to make excuses. We cannot, Your Majesty. Our crime is indefensible. We can only beg for mercy we don't deserve. Mercy, Cassian repeated, tasting the word like poison. You wanted to murder my mate and my children, and you're asking me for mercy. Not for ourselves, Greymane said quickly. For our children. They knew nothing of the plot. Let your justice fall on us alone. I saw Adrian's hand tighten on Cassian's arm, a small gesture, but one he felt. He glanced at her, and whatever he saw on her face made him pause. Exile, Cassian said finally, and the word fell like a stone into still water. You have 72 hours to settle your affairs and leave my territory. Your titles are stripped, your lands forfeit to the crown, your bloodlines barred from holding position in this kingdom for 3 generations. If any member of your families is found within my borders after the deadline, they will be executed on sight. Your children, being innocent, may remain if they have other family to take them in. That is my mercy. Be grateful for it. The 3 lords bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched the floor, relief and grief warring on their faces. Exile was devastating, but it was life. They'd keep their lives. The next group wasn't so fortunate. 5 nobles who'd actively participated in planning the attack, who'd known about the silver weapons, who'd helped coordinate the timing, who'd promised the assassins rewards and safe passage out of the kingdom. These weren't men who'd merely funded a crime, these were men who'd tried to orchestrate the death of their queen. Cassian didn't give them a chance to speak. You will be executed at dawn. Your families will be stripped of title and lands. Your names will be removed from the records of noble lineage. In 2 generations, no one will remember you existed except as a warning about the price of treason. One of them, Lord Harwick, I think made the mistake of trying to argue. Your Majesty, we only sought what was best for the kingdom. A queen of proper breeding, heirs of pure bloodline. You sought power. Cassian cut him off, his voice dropping to something deadly. You sought to murder my mate because she wasn't useful to your political ambitions. You sought to kill my children because their existence threatened your plans to put your own bloodlines on my throne. Don't dress it up in pretty words about breeding and propriety. You're conspirators and attempted murderers, and you'll die as such. The guards dragged them away, their protests echoing through the throne room until the doors slammed shut behind them. The remaining nobles shifted uncomfortably, probably wondering if they'd be next, if some tangential connection they didn't even know about would see them following the conspirators to the executioner's block. Cassian let them wonder for another long moment. Then he turned to Adrian, and his entire demeanor changed. The cold fury melted into something that looked almost tender as he took her hand. "Kneel," he said, but it was gentle, nothing like the commanding tone he'd used with the conspirators. Adrian looked confused but did as he asked, lowering herself carefully to kneel before the throne. The assembled nobles went absolutely silent, every eye fixed on their king and the woman who carried his heirs. "Adrian Thornbrook," Cassian said, his voice ringing through the chamber with absolute authority. "You came to this palace as a healer's daughter seeking answers. You offered yourself to prove your father's research, to heal wounds everyone said were unhealable. You endured weeks of political hostility and attempts on your life. You gave me back my future when I'd stopped believing I had one." He drew the ceremonial sword from his belt, the one that had been carried by Lycan kings for generations, and held it point down in front of her. "But you've never been formally recognized for what you are, what you've become, what you've earned." He touched the sword to her right shoulder, then her left, in the old ritual. "By my authority as king of the Lycan territories, by the right of conquest and blood and the oath of my people, I name you Adrian Thornridge, Queen of the Northern Pack, Lady of the Winter Throne, Keeper of the Royal Line, and," his voice softened, "my mate, my heart, my future." The throne room erupted into applause, partly genuine joy from those who'd come to respect Adrian, partly political necessity from those who knew better than to appear anything less than ecstatic about their king's choice. But Cassian only had eyes for Adrian as he sheathed the sword and helped her to her feet. She was crying silent tears tracking down her face even as she smiled. He wiped them away with his thumb, and I saw him lean down to whisper something in her ear that made her laugh through the tears. What she told me later, after the ceremony had ended and the nobles had dispersed to gossip and recalibrate their political strategies around this new reality, was that Cassian had whispered, "You're officially stuck with me now. No backing out," and she'd whispered back. This escalated quickly, which had made him laugh, actually laugh, right there in the middle of the most formal political ceremony the kingdom had seen in decades. The sound had startled some of the more austere nobles, who probably couldn't remember the last time they'd heard their king express genuine joy. But that's what Adrian had given him. Not just heirs, though those were growing safely in her womb. Not just political stability, though her pregnancy had secured the succession and silenced most of the opposition. She'd given him back the ability to feel joy without guilt, to hope without the crushing weight of 60 years of disappointment, to love without the fear that it would be used against him. The formal reception afterward was elaborate, the kind of political theater that Cassian normally despised but endured, because it mattered to the nobles who needed to feel included in important moments. There were speeches and toasts and elaborate gifts presented to the new queen, and through it all Adrian maintained perfect composure even though I could see her energy flagging. Finally, as the sun began to set and the twins started making their presence known, Adrian had mentioned they seemed to wake up and start moving around. This time of day Cassian announced that the queen needed rest, and no amount of political necessity could keep him from escorting her personally back to their chambers. The nobles bowed and murmured appropriate things about the queen's health, but I saw the calculation in some of their eyes. Saw them reassessing, recalibrating, trying to figure out how to navigate a kingdom where their king was clearly, obviously, completely devoted to a woman they'd underestimated. Good. Let them figure it out. Let them understand that the political landscape had shifted permanently the moment Adrian Thornbrook had walked into that selection ceremony and offered Cassian something more valuable than political alliance or prestigious. Bloodlines. She'd offered him herself, honestly, completely, without pretense or calculation, and in doing so she'd changed everything. As I watched them leave the throne room together, Cassian's hand protective on the small of her back, Adrian leaning into him with the trust of someone who knew absolutely that he would protect her against anything. I understood something that the conspirators had failed to grasp. They'd thought Adrian was Cassian's weakness, a common-born healer who'd gotten lucky, who could be eliminated to restore the proper order of things. They couldn't have been more wrong. Adrian wasn't his weakness, she was his strength, the thing that made him more dangerous than he'd been in 60 years of ruling alone, because now he had something worth protecting, something worth fighting for beyond duty or honor or the weight of a crown. He had love. Real, complicated, absolutely terrifying love. And anyone who threatened that was about to learn exactly why Cassian Thornridge had earned the title Unbroken. Not because he couldn't be hurt, but because he refused to let anything break what mattered most. The storm came 3 weeks before the twins were due. Not a normal winter storm, but the kind of tempest that old wolves whispered about in legends, the kind that only appeared when something significant was about to happen, when the world itself was holding its breath waiting for change. The wind howled like dying gods around the palace towers, and snow fell so thick you couldn't see 5 feet in front of your face. Lightning cracked across the sky in patterns that had no business existing in a snowstorm, and the temperature dropped so fast that ice formed on the inside of windows. And in the middle of all that chaos, Adrian's water broke. I was outside the royal chambers when I heard her cry out, not a scream exactly, but a sound of shocked pain that made every wolf in the corridor freeze. Then Cassian's voice, rough with barely controlled panic. "Marcus, get the healers. Now." I ran, sprinted through corridors that were already filling with concerned palace staff, burst into the healing wing where the head healer was preparing for bed, and the look on my face must have said everything because she was moving before I could get words out. "The Queen? In labor. 3 weeks early. The storm is the least of our problems," she finished grimly, already gathering her team. "Twins born to a newly healed bloodline, 3 weeks premature, and both carrying dominant alpha genetics according to the scans. This was always going to be complicated. Complicated. That was one word for it. What followed were 12 hours that aged everyone in that palace by years. 12 hours of Adrian's screams cutting through the storm's howl, of Cassian refusing to leave her side despite the healer's suggestions that he wait outside, of her breaking bones in his hands as she gripped them through contractions that came faster and harder than they should have. The first twin, the boy, came breech. Wrong position, too big, his dominant alpha nature making him fight the birth process like it was a battle to be won. The healers worked frantically, trying to turn him, and I could hear Adrian sobbing that she couldn't do this, couldn't survive this, that something was wrong. "Yes, you can." Cassian's voice cut through her panic, steady despite the terror I could smell rolling off him in waves. "You endured weeks of silver treatments to heal me. You survived an assassination attempt. You faced down hostile nobles and political conspiracies and threats to our lives. You can do this, Adrian. You're the strongest person I know." "I'm scared," she gasped between contractions. "So am I," he admitted, pressing his forehead to hers. "Terrified. But we're doing this together, remember? That's what we promised. Together." The boy finally came at hour 9, emerging with a lusty cry that rattled the windows and made every wolf in the palace straighten with instinctive recognition. That was an alpha's cry, strong, demanding, announcing his arrival to the world like he owned it. The healers moved quickly, checking him, cleaning him, and then placing him in Cassian's arms because Adrian still had another child to deliver. I watched Cassian's face as he held his son for the first time, watched 60 years of grief and disappointment and buried hope crack open like ice in spring thaw. Tears streamed down his face, this powerful king who'd faced down armies without flinching, who'd ruled with absolute authority for decades, completely undone by 7 pounds of squalling infant. "He's perfect," Cassian whispered, his voice breaking. "Adrian, he's perfect." But Adrian couldn't respond, because the second twin, the girl, was coming, and something was wrong. The contractions had stopped, just stopped, like her body had decided it was done despite the fact that there was still a child inside her. The head healer's face went pale, her hands moving quickly over Adrian's abdomen, and the fear in the room ratcheted up to something almost visible. "The second twin's heartbeat is dropping," she said quickly, professionally, but I could hear the panic underneath. "She's in distress. We need to get her out now." "Do it," Cassian said immediately, even though now meant cutting Adrian open, meant silver surgical tools because nothing else would cut through a Lycan queen's enhanced healing fast enough, meant pain that would be excruciating despite whatever numbing agents they could provide. Adrian, exhausted from 9 hours of labor, looked up at Cassian with eyes that were glassy with pain and fear. "Save her," she whispered. "Whatever it takes. Promise me." "I promise," he said, handing their son to a waiting nurse and taking Adrian's hand again. "But you're both surviving this. Both of you. I didn't wait 60 years to get you just to lose you now." The surgery was brutal. Quick, efficient, necessary, and absolutely brutal. The silver scalpel cut through skin and muscle, while Adrian bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming, her free hand crushing Cassian's with strength born of agony. The head healer worked with the speed of long practice, her hands steady even as so much blood pooled on the table. And then, finally, a second cry joined the storm. Weaker than her brother's, more uncertain, but there, alive, fighting. The girl was smaller, her skin faintly tinged blue from oxygen deprivation, and for one horrible moment she wasn't breathing properly. The healers worked over her with frantic precision, clearing her airways, stimulating her to breathe, and everyone in that room held their breath waiting to see if this miracle that had taken 60 years to create would survive its first minutes of life. Then she cried, really cried, with the same demanding intensity as her brother, and the relief in the room was almost physical. "She's strong," the head healer announced, placing the girl on Adrian's chest while the other healers worked to stitch the surgical incision closed. "Smaller than her brother, but her vitals are stabilizing. Both children are healthy. Both are alpha-dominant. Your Majesties, you have a son and a daughter." Adrian, pale and shaking from blood loss and exhaustion and the aftermath of surgery, looked down at the tiny girl on her chest with an expression of such profound love and relief that it hurt to witness. Then she looked up at Cassian, who was still holding himself together through sheer force of will, and she smiled. "We did it," she whispered. "Cassian, we actually did it." That's when he broke. Completely, utterly broke. This king who'd spent 60 years being strong, being invulnerable, being everything everyone needed him to be, he collapsed into the chair beside the bed and wept like his heart was being torn from his chest. Deep, wrenching sobs that he muffled against Adrian's shoulder, while she ran her free hand through his hair and whispered that it was okay. They were all okay. They were going to be fine. The healers, tactful and understanding, quietly finished their work and backed away, giving the new family privacy in those first precious moments. I stood guard at the door, keeping everyone else out, while inside that room Cassian held his mate and their daughter and slowly pulled himself back together. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were red and swollen, his face blotchy with tears, and he looked more human than I'd ever seen him. "I'm sorry," he said roughly. "I should be stronger than this. You should be exactly what you are," Adrian interrupted gently. "A father meeting his children for the first time. A man who waited 60 years for this moment. You're allowed to feel it, Cassian. All of it." He leaned down to kiss her, gentle, reverent, full of love and gratitude and wonder, then turned to look at his son, who the nurses had brought back over now that the immediate crisis had passed. The boy was wrapped in soft blankets, his eyes squeezed shut, his tiny fists waving in the air like he was already preparing to fight the world. "What do we name them?" Cassian asked, his voice still rough with emotion. Adrian looked down at their daughter, then over at their son, and something peaceful settled over her features despite the obvious exhaustion and pain. "The boy should be Kieran," she said. "It means little dark one in the old language. And the girl," she paused, touching the baby's tiny hand. "Alara, it means shining light." "Kieran and Alara Thornridge," Cassian repeated, testing the names. "Heirs to the Northern Pack, son and daughter of the impossible." He reached out to touch Alara's cheek with one careful finger, this huge warrior's hand so gentle against his daughter's fragile skin. "You terrified me," he told her softly, that heartbeat dropping, thinking I might lose you before I even got to meet you. "Don't do that again." As if in response, Alara's tiny hand wrapped around his finger with surprising strength, and Cassian laughed a sound of pure joy that seemed to push back the storm outside, to fill the room with light that had nothing to do with the flickering candles. Outside, the storm began to break. The wind died down to a whisper, the snow eased to gentle flakes, and the impossible lightning finally stopped fracturing the sky. It was like the world had been waiting, holding its breath through the birth of these impossible children, and now it could finally exhale. The heirs had arrived. Against all odds, against 60 years of being told it was impossible, against assassination attempts and political conspiracies, and the weight of history itself. 2 perfect, healthy, impossibly alive children who would grow up knowing that they were born from love and hope, and the absolute refusal of their parents to accept that some things couldn't be healed. Kieran and Alara Thornridge, the miracle twins. The children who proved that sometimes, when you found the right person, when you had enough faith and enough love and enough stubborn determination to fight for what mattered, sometimes the impossible became possible after all. 3 months after the twins were born, I walked into Cassian's private study and found him doing something I'd never seen in all my years of service. He was lying on the floor. Not collapsed, not injured, just stretched out on the thick carpet with Kieran on his chest and Alara tucked into the crook of his arm, both babies making those soft, contented sounds that infants make when they're exactly where they want to be. Cassian's eyes were closed, his face completely relaxed, and for a moment I almost backed out because this felt too private, too precious to interrupt. But he must have heard me because his eyes opened, and instead of the sharp alertness I usually saw there, I found something that looked like peace. "Marcus," he said quietly, careful not to disturb the babies. "What is it?" "The final medical report from the healers," I said, holding up the document. "You asked to see it immediately." Something flickered in his eyes, anticipation mixed with old fear, but he nodded. "Read it to me." I opened the scroll and began. Complete examination of King Cassian Thornridge, 3 months post-birth of heirs. All silver particles successfully purged from system. Scar tissue fully healed for the first time in 60 years. Cellular regeneration normal. Blood work shows no trace of silver poisoning. Reproductive system fully functional. Prognosis. I paused, because this part still amazed me. Full recovery. Complete reversal of all previous damage. The silence that followed was profound. Cassian stared at the ceiling, his hand absently stroking Alara's back, while Kieran drooled contentedly on his shirt, and I watched him process what I'd just read. 60 years of damage, gone. 60 years of being told he was broken, reversed. All of it healed, all of it restored, because one woman had believed her father's research and refused to accept that some things were impossible. "Thank you, Marcus," he said finally, his voice suspiciously rough. "That will be all." I left him there with his children, with the proof that miracles weren't just stories told to give people hope. Sometimes they were real, messy, painful, and absolutely worth every moment of suffering it took to reach them. The kingdom healed slowly, the way deep wounds always do. The noble houses that had supported the conspiracy were replaced with families who'd proven their loyalty not through grand gestures or political maneuvering, but through steady support during the difficult months of Adrian's pregnancy and the twins' birth. New alliances formed, built on respect rather than fear, on genuine admiration for a queen who'd proven herself in every way that mattered. Adrian's reputation transformed. The nobles who dismissed her as a common healer learned to seek her counsel on matters ranging from public health to diplomatic relations. She had a way of seeing problems from angles they'd never considered, of finding solutions that benefited everyone rather than serving political agendas. And her medical expertise became invaluable. She'd begun training other healers in her father's techniques for treating silver poisoning, work that would save countless lives in the years to come. But more than that, she'd given the kingdom something it desperately needed: hope, real, tangible hope that change was possible, that old wounds could heal, that the future didn't have to be a repeat of the past. I watched her grow into her role as queen, with the same determination she'd brought to healing Cassian. She sat in on council meetings, not as decoration, but as a full participant, her insights often cutting through political posturing to the heart of issues. She walked through the palace and the city beyond, talking to people of all ranks, learning about their lives and their struggles in a way that made them feel seen and valued. And through it all, Cassian watched her with an expression that never quite stopped being wonder, like he still couldn't believe this brilliant, stubborn, impossibly brave woman had chosen him. Like every day with her was a gift he'd never expected to receive. 6 months after the twins were born, there was a ceremony in the throne room, not a political necessity this time, but something Cassian insisted on. A formal recognition of the healers who'd worked on him over the years, particularly those who'd assisted with the silver extraction treatments. He gave them honors and titles and land grants, but more importantly, he gave them credit for their work in front of the entire court. "These people," he said, gesturing to the assembled healers, "reminded me that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about refusing to accept that anything is beyond repair. It's about having the courage to try when everyone else says it's impossible. And it's about caring enough to endure the pain of the treatment, trusting that something better waits on the other side. His eyes found Adrian in the crowd, and the love in that look was so naked, so profound, that several people looked away out of instinctive courtesy. My queen taught me that. She taught all of us that, and I wanted to make sure her father's legacy, Marcus Thornbrook's research and dedication, was properly honored. He unveiled a statue then, commissioned months earlier and kept secret. It depicted Marcus Thornbrook at his research desk, surrounded by his notes and instruments, his face etched with the determined focus of a man who refused to give up on finding answers. At the base was a plaque. Marcus Thornbrook, Master Healer, who believed that impossible was just another word for not yet solved. I saw Adrian press her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face, and Cassian descended from the dais to pull her into his arms in full view of the court. Let them see it. Let them see that their king loved his queen, that strength and tenderness weren't opposites but complementary forces. The twins grew. Kieran was bold and demanding, already showing signs of the dominant alpha he'd become. He wanted attention, wanted to be held constantly, would howl with indignation if he felt neglected. Alara was quieter but no less strong, her gray eyes watchful and intelligent, already studying the world around her with the focus of someone who missed nothing. They were perfect, infuriating and exhausting, and absolutely perfect. One night, nearly a year after their birth, I found myself standing guard outside the royal chambers long after my shift should have ended. Through the partially open door, I could see into the room where two ornate cradles sat side by side, moonlight streaming through the windows to illuminate the sleeping infants inside. Cassian and Adrian stood between the cradles, his arm around her waist, both of them just watching their children sleep with expressions of contentment so complete it was almost painful to witness. They were talking in low voices, and though I should have stepped away, given them privacy, something made me stay and listen. "Do you ever think about it?" Adrian was asking. "How close we came to this never happening?" "Every day," Cassian admitted. "Every single day I wake up and see you beside me, see them in their cradles, and I have this moment of disbelief that it's real, that they're real, that this isn't just another dream I'm about to wake from. It's real," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Your scans are perfect. The silver is completely gone. Your body has healed in ways the healers said were impossible. And these two," she gestured to the sleeping twins, "are the proof that sometimes miracles happen when you're brave enough to try for them." Cassian turned to look at her, and in the moonlight I could see every line of love and gratitude etched into his features. "They said I'd never be a father," he murmured, the words carrying the weight of 60 years of grief and disappointment. "Every healer, every expert, every well-meaning advisor, they all said it was impossible, that the silver had destroyed something fundamental that could never be recovered." Adrian reached up to cup his face in her hands, standing on her toes to make eye contact more easily. "You just needed better care," she said, and there was such tenderness in her voice, such absolute certainty. "You needed someone who understood that healing isn't about accepting limitations, it's about finding new ways around them. You needed someone who cared enough to make you endure the pain of recovery. You needed—" "You," Cassian interrupted, pulling her closer. "I needed you. Not a healer, not a political alliance, not any of the things I thought I was looking for. I just needed you, Adrian. Your stubborn refusal to accept that some things can't be fixed, your brilliant mind and your brave heart and your absolutely terrifying faith that we could make this work." They kissed then, soft and sweet, and when they pulled apart, Adrian was smiling. "We did make it work. Against every odd, despite every obstacle, we made it work. And now we have this," she gestured to encompass the room, the sleeping twins, the life they'd built together. "Now we have everything." "Everything," Cassian agreed, and the wonder in his voice suggested he still couldn't quite believe it. They stood there for a while longer, just watching their children breathe, their presence a promise that these twins would grow up surrounded by love and security and the absolute certainty that they were wanted, that they were miracles, yes, but also just children who would be cherished for exactly who they were. Finally, they moved toward their own bed, exhausted from another day of ruling and parenting and managing all the complex demands of their positions. But before they did, Cassian stopped at each cradle, bending to press a gentle kiss to first Kieran's forehead, then Alara's, whispering something too quiet for me to hear. A blessing, maybe. Or a promise. Or just a father telling his children that they were loved beyond measure, that they would always be protected, that their existence was the answer to prayers he'd stopped believing would ever be answered. I finally stepped away from the door, moved back to my post, and let them have their privacy. But the image stayed with me, would always stay with me, of those two cradles side by side in the moonlight, holding the future of the kingdom and the proof that love could accomplish what politics and power never could. The Lycan king had his heirs, the impossible children who existed because two people had been brave enough to try when everyone said it was hopeless, had been stubborn enough to endure pain when it would have been easier to give up, had been faithful enough to believe that healing was possible, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Two cradles, one future, and a love story that would be told for generations, not because it was easy or simple or followed any expected pattern, but because it was real. Because sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the ones that come from magic or destiny or divine intervention. Sometimes they're the ones that come from two broken people choosing to heal each other, from believing that impossible is just another word for not yet, from refusing to accept that some wounds are too deep to mend. Cassian and Adrian had proven that, and their children, Kieran and Alara, the miracle twins, the heirs who shouldn't exist, were living proof that sometimes, when you find the right person and you're willing to fight for what matters most, the impossible becomes gloriously, beautifully, undeniably possible. The kingdom had its future. The king had his family. And the healer's daughter who'd walked into a selection ceremony seeking answers had found something infinitely more valuable. She'd found home, she'd found love, she'd found proof that her father's research and her own faith weren't misplaced, and she'd given a king who'd lost hope 60 years ago a reason to believe in miracles again. That was worth everything they'd endured to get here. Every painful treatment, every political battle, every moment of fear and uncertainty, all of it, absolutely worth it. For this, for them, for the future sleeping peacefully in those two cradles, unaware of how impossible their existence was, how many obstacles had been overcome to bring them into the world. Just two babies, breathing softly in the moonlight. Two babies who changed everything. Thank you for listening to another emotional, magical shifter romance here on Tina Romance Library. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, so you never miss more powerful, heart-gripping romance stories.